In this video, you will be presented with important information about a phenomenon taking place in visual long-term memory that applies to real-world vision. It is important that you pay attention throughout this video because your understanding will be tested in a quiz at the end of this presentation. If you do not pass the quiz, then you'll have to watch the video again and retake the quiz before we can move on to the final part of the experiment. In the final part of the experiment, you'll be applying what you have learned from this video in a simple computer task, kind of like a video game. Work in our lab suggests that recognizing an object by pulling it out of memory can cause the forgetting of other objects in that category that are also stored in memory. By category, we mean semantic category. For example, a semantic category would be the category dogs or cars or butterflies. If we take the example of butterflies, a blue butterfly would be an object in the overarching category of butterfly. A green butterfly would also fall into this category, and so on. In this example, blue and green butterflies are specific butterflies that are all grouped under the more general category of butterfly. So, we are observing the forgetting of objects within a category, which is caused by pulling other objects in that same category out of memory. Pulling one butterfly out of memory would cause the forgetting of other butterflies, also stored in memory but not recognized. This forgetting is interesting because in the real world, we are constantly encountering lots of objects that belong to broader categories. For example, walking across campus, we see lots of faces. Driving down the road, we see lots of cars, and walking in the park, we see lots of trees. This effect of forgetting within a category is observed in our lab, has been termed recognition-induced forgetting, or RIF for short. Recognition-induced forgetting is when recognizing an object from a specific category, for example the red apple, consequently causes the forgetting of other objects in that same category, for example the green apple. Recognition-induced forgetting is a good term for this forgetting effect because it is the forgetting of an object or objects induced or caused by the recognition of other objects within that same category. A good example of how this works involves our two apples here. First, you can see there is a red apple and a green apple. Next, the green apple goes away, meaning it is stored in memory and we are no longer thinking about it, while we practice recognizing the red apple a few times. By practice recognizing, we mean our memory is tested for that red apple, and we need to confirm that yes, we have seen it before. You recognize this red apple from a few moments ago. And here you recognize it again. After practicing the red apple a few times, by which we mean you pulled it out of memory a few times to answer that yes, you have seen it before, you have forgotten that you had previously seen the green apple. Recognizing the red apple has caused or induced the forgetting of the green apple. Of course, in this example, you probably didn't really forget the green apple, but this is an oversimplified version of what you will experience in the actual experiment. The reason it works in the real experiments we run in the lab, but probably didn't work here with the apple example, is because there will be many more images and categories. This next example will illustrate in a little bit more detail how the actual experiment will go. Remember, you are going to take part in the real experiment, but you are first learning about this forgetting effect because your task is going to be resist recognition-induced forgetting, or to try to not let it happen. There will be three phases in this experiment. The first phase is a study phase, where you will be shown images that you need to remember. You will be asked to watch the screen as the program presents each image, one at a time for a few seconds. You will need to pay close attention to the details of each image shown because you will be asked about your memory for them later on. You will also be repeating the word "the" out loud over and over again throughout the study phase. This is just to prevent you from saying anything about the objects. After this study phase, there will be a 5-minute break where you will perform a visual search task. The second phase is a practice phase where you will practice recognizing some of the images you saw in the first phase. Remember, this means you'll be shown an object and asked if you have seen it before in the experiment. This will be harder than the apple example because mixed in with old objects will be new objects you have not seen yet, and you'll need to answer no to those objects. You will respond by pressing a button to indicate whether or not you have seen each of the images earlier in the experiment. One button is labeled yes and the other is labeled no. The third phase is the test phase, where you will see again images presented at some point earlier in the experiment and images that have not yet been shown before in the experiment. Your task will be the same as it was in the practice phase. You will again respond via button press to report whether or not you have seen an image before. But this time the question is whether or not you've ever seen the picture at any point in the experiment. Now that you know what the experiment experiment will look like, I'm going to remind you how forgetting happens because I want you to resist the forgetting. I want you to do your best to remember the objects and not show recognition-induced forgetting. So within the experiment, there are various types of objects that serve different roles. We call them practiced objects, highlighted in pink here, related objects, highlighted in red, and baseline objects, shown in green. The first type I mentioned is practiced objects. An example of a practiced object is circled in pink in the diagram on this slide. As you can see, they are shown in all three phases of the experiment and will most likely be the easiest to remember because not only do you study them in the first phase, but you also practice recognizing them in the second phase. You'll have seen these objects several times once you're in the test phase. Remembering these objects during the practice phase is what causes the forgetting of another category of objects called related objects. Related objects, shown here in red, are the objects that are more easily forgotten due to their overarching category being practiced in the second phase, although they themselves are not practiced. So because you practice recognizing the orange butterfly from the category butterfly that was circled in pink on the previous slide, you would now forget the green butterfly from the same category when asked about it in the test phase. If you wanted to try to overcome recognition-induced forgetting, these are the images that you would need to do your best to remember. In other words, if we are testing your memory for an object in the practice phase, what we are trying to do is make you forget the related objects, objects from the same category that you are not recognizing during the practice phase. Be sure to make note of this because it's an important point that relates to your mission in this experiment. The final group of objects is baseline objects. These objects serve as a way to determine just how much you forgot the related objects. An example of a baseline object is circled here in green. Like the related objects, they also only appear in the first and third phases of the experiment. However, unlike the related objects, their category is not practiced at all in the second phase, the practice phase of the experiment. Here you see that none of the chairs were practiced. When we want to show that recognition-induced forgetting happens, we show that memory for related objects is worse than memory for baseline objects. Let me show you what I mean on the next slide. This graph plots what typically happens in recognition-induced forgetting experiments. As you can see, the practiced objects have the highest rates of remembering. This makes sense because they were seen multiple times throughout the experiment, in all three phases. The green line here between the two gray boxes represents the rate of remembering for the baseline objects. These objects are not remembered as well as the practiced ones, but this is expected as the baseline objects were not practiced. They were only shown once in the study phase, so you would expect them to do worse than the objects that were practiced. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Notice that subjects have the worst memory for the related objects, even though they were shown the exact same number of times as the baseline objects. They were only studied in the first phase, just like the baseline objects. The only difference between baseline and related objects is that the related objects belong to a category that had some objects practiced in phase 2, unlike the baseline objects. This is the reason we call the forgetting of related objects recognition-induced forgetting. The process of recognizing some of the objects in a category induced or caused the forgetting of other objects in that category. In conclusion, recognition-induced forgetting occurs when practice recognizing an object from a specific category worsens your memory for non-practiced objects in that same category. Practiced objects, or objects shown in every phase of the experiment, are objects that induce the forgetting of the related objects. Related objects are the objects that are forgotten because they are drawn from the same category as practice objects. Since your mission is to resist RIF, you really need to be sure you do not forget those related objects. Please notify the experimenter that you have finished this video and are ready to take the quiz. Once you pass the quiz, you will begin to take part in a RIF experiment. This last point is very important. Remember, your mission is to try to resist the forgetting effect that typically results from this experiment. When you get to the computer task, do your best to accomplish this.